The humble box joint, or as JKM likes to call them,
Dovetail's ugly cousin,
is one of those joints that, at least in my opinion, just looks right. They're strong, they're practical, and when they're cut cleanly, they can completely transform a simple box project. The problem is that most box joint jigs tend to involve some sort of compromise. They're either built for a single finger size, or they require a lot of setup, or they can be surprisingly expensive.
oh my god!
A while ago I came across two designs that really stood out to me. My friend Mario, aka the Woodfather, his clever template-based system, and Mattias Wandel's screw-driven indexing mechanism. And that got me wondering, what would happen if I combined the best parts of both designs into a single jig, and then added a few ideas of my own? So when I started this project, there were basically three main goals I wanted to achieve. The first was to incorporate some sort of screw-driven advancement mechanism system, something that would let me move the workpiece quickly, accurately, and without having to constantly reposition it by hand. The second was to incorporate some sort of template system, so I wanted to easily change the size and layout of the box joints without a complicated setup process, and ideally avoid doing any more maths than was absolutely necessary. And thirdly, I want to achieve all of that using pretty stock standard saw blades, so any single blade that had at least a flat tooth top, and certainly I didn't want to use dado stacks or any special blades that would require, additional setup other than perhaps changing them in and out like a normal saw blade. So after several months of tinkering, a handful of prototypes, and more hours in CAD that I'd care to admit, this is where I ended up. At its core, the design retains the simplicity of Mario's template-based system, allowing different finger layouts to be swapped in and out quickly, but also incorporates the screw-driven advancement mechanism inspired by Mattias' design and adapted into, I would say, a little bit more of a compact package. So the first part of this project is to cut the pieces for the base and the main block. I don't have a piece of stock thick enough to cover this piece, so I'm going to use some of this off-cut pine panel I have and laminate two pieces together. While cutting this from a solid piece would probably save me a lot of time and effort, this is one of those projects and opportunities to use up a lot of the scrap I have laying around. From the same pine panel offcut, I'm going to make the base. Now I prefer to use some form ply for this, but I don't have any scrap pieces the right size, and I don't want to cut into my last sheet just for a tiny piece like this. I'll use the thicknesser to get it down to the ideal width, which is 17mm. The next part is the front support fence. This part again calls for 17mm form ply, but I'm going to keep using up this pine panel. If you plan on building one of these for yourself, you can save a lot of time and effort and just get yourself some 17mm or 3/4 inch plywood. I left the main block overnight and then came back the next day, running it through the joiner to get it square, through the thicknesser to get it down to height, and finally through the table saw for final width. Next is the part for the sliding front fence. This is the part that will move with the advancement mechanism and is going to receive some dovetail grooves to accept my micro jig clamps. Now of course this part's optional, I'm using it because I have these clamps, but if you prefer to use some F clamps or quick grip clamps, then yeah, you can use those as well. Now the last time I tried making dovetail grooves, I made a complete schmozzle of it. I neglected to hog out the material in the middle, and I just asked way too much of a simple router bit. I've learnt my lesson this time, and I'm going to remove the bulk of it using my single blade dado. This is a 4mm flat top blade, and it's the one I'm actually going to be using in the setup with this jig. I will go into a bit more detail regarding blades and this jig later on. Having a dedicated zero clearance for this blade makes it really easy and quick to line up the grooves. I can just line up the mark with the inside or outside of the insert and it'll tell me exactly where the blade's going to cut. So the next part is to run these grooves through the router table using a 14-degree V-bit. And I'd love to show you that, but for some reason my camera didn't want to record this, so here is a dramatic dramatization of what that looked like. So now that we have most of our cutout parts required, we can begin some assembly. I'm going to start by attaching the main block to the support fence. You'll want to make sure that this is nice and square, and while you could glue this part together, I actually recommend just using screws, just in case you need to replace or make adjustments to the main block, since your blade is actually going to cut into this part. Now I'm just putting 2 screws in at each end, but not towards the middle just yet, and I'll explain why later. Now the next step is to start installing some of our 3D printed components. Now I know not everyone has a 3D printer, and for some of you, seeing plastic parts in a woodworking project isn't going to be your favourite thing. I've never made it a secret of how much I use 3D printing in my workshop. It's definitely allowed me to explore all sorts of solutions, from jigs and fixtures through to dust collection and automation projects. And for the record, I've never been sponsored by a 3D printer company or paid to use this technology. I simply use it because it's another tool in the workshop that helps me solve problems. And it's a technology that I highly recommend. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that my goal here is not necessarily to show you exactly how you should build one of these, but hopefully inspire you to make your own in a way that's approachable and possible with the tools and materials at your disposal. Having said all that, any plans I do happen to release, I'll include as many templates and files that support other technologies and tools, such as CNCs, laser cutters, or even going the old-fashioned router path. This is the handle crank mechanism that will turn our threaded rod. There will be 2 gears here, the point of which is to speed up the advancement. Now you could probably get away with using a handle directly on the threaded rod, but this will make the advancement quite slow. Next, we assemble the sliding template adapter. This is the part that will move along our threaded rod, referencing our template, as well as allowing our DRO to engage. I just use a bit of super glue here. There isn't going to be any load here, so this should be fine, but you may prefer to use something like epoxy or something a little bit stronger for plastic. And then we can set this aside to dry. So while that dries, I'm going to prep our threaded rod. Now this is an M8 threaded rod, and here I'm adding a flat section to the end of it. This is going to allow us to use a grub screw to lock in the small cog to the rod. The sliding template adapter is now dry, and we can insert our M8 nuts. These are fixed in place inside the 3D print, so as the threaded rod turns, the adapter will slide up and down our jig. We can now insert the threaded rod into our jig and capture our sliding template adapter. And to make this go quicker, I've chucked up my drill at the other end. So here is our cog, and there is a small slot in the side to insert an M5 nut, which will accept an M5 grub screw, which will secure our cog to the rod. And just a quick test to make sure that it's all engaging properly. The next step is to glue some T-track into the groove that's on the sliding adapter. This T-track is to allow us to make adjustments with the template system, which will become more obvious later. There isn't any load here, so again I'm just using some CA glue, but if you prefer you can swap this out for something like epoxy. I'm turning my attention to the sled now. Off camera I cut a pair of hardwood runners and used some spacers, in this case a few square nuts, to raise them slightly above the table surface. Using the fence as a reference, I roughly align the center of the base with where the blade will eventually pass through the sled. A little bit of CA glue to hold the runners in position, and after giving them a few moments to set, I drill and drive some screws to permanently secure them. Finally, I trim the excess material from the runners with a flush cut saw. Next up is this zero clearance strip at the front of the jig. The sliding fence will run along this piece, and the idea is pretty simple. When we're making cuts, we'll be cutting into this strip instead of the main fence. That means the fence stays protected, and we also get a permanent zero clearance reference that shouldn't need to be replaced. Or at least not very often. Now by doing it this way, it does mean that we are limiting the height of our cuts. So I've settled on something like 40mm here, because realistically, I don't think I'll ever be cutting box joints much larger than that. Here I'm attaching the guide block to the main fence. This part runs from the top to the bottom and it moves along with the main fence. And this part also helps to keep the main fence aligned. A couple screws from the back is all it takes. We can now start to fully understand how this mechanism is going to work. And finally we can trim the threaded rod down to size and install an M8 nylon nut. It's now time to attach the fence assembly to the base. To start, I'll roughly position it where it looks square and clamp everything in place. Once I'm happy with the position, I'll drive a single screw through the base into one side of the fence, and this will give me a pivot point while we start allowing for some adjustment. Next I'll make a first cut through the main base to establish the blade line. Using a square registered against the saw blade, I can then accurately align the fence perpendicular to the cut. And once everything is square, I'll clamp it down again and drive a second screw through the base to permanently lock it in that position. Next I glue in a small strip that'll support the templates. This should stop them from slipping out the back when being used, and it's just a piece of leftover from another project. So this is our DRO, or digital readout, and it's an off-the-shelf unit that cost me about 45 Australian dollars, and it's going to add another level of precision to the jig. Now, is a DRO on a box joint jig a little excessive? Well, quite possibly, but for the price, I figured it was worth experimenting with. I've not fully tested it yet, so I'm keen to see how useful it ends up being in practice. It's mounted at both ends using a couple of brackets and some M5 screws, which keeps everything nice and rigid. The DRO unit registers two little grooves that are on the template adapter, so they slot in and allow it to move with the adapter as we go backwards and forwards. Second to last thing to install is the tightening wheel. This will be used to keep the template locked in place. It's nothing more than an M8 bolt that has this little 3D printed wheel, and I'll go into more detail on this when we do our first demos. Now, one little change I have made is to add a groove to the bottom of the sacrificial fence and one to the upper fence. This groove accepts a 4mm mating piece, which just helps keep the bottom of the upper fence aligned with the bottom, locking it in and stopping it from bulging out. Now the final part to be added is this little 3D printed flip stop. The key part of this is the flip stop itself, which actually represents the thickness of my table saw blade. This will be important when we are using the template so that we have a visual reference of where our blade is going to be cutting. It just attaches to our T-track with a small M5 knob and an M5 square nut. And that's it, the build is now complete. So there we have it, the build's finished. Now comes the fun part, putting the jig to work and seeing whether or not we can produce accurate, repeatable box joints. So the first thing we need to do is install our template or profile. Now the one I'm using here is 3D printed, but there's no reason it couldn't be made from wood instead. This one is a 10mm template, which means each finger and each gap is going to end up 10mm wide. The template simply drops into the middle of the jig. I then use these locating blocks and side screw to roughly position it. It doesn't have to be perfectly centered because the flip stop can slide along the T-track, and that lets us fine tune its position relative to the template later. Next we set the height of the blade. Using a sample piece that's the same thickness as our workpiece, I'm raising the blade so it's just slightly proud of the material. This will leave the fingers a fraction longer than needed, but that allows us to sand or trim them perfectly flush later. Next we can insert our workpiece into the jig. It doesn't have to be positioned in any specific location, but you do want to make sure that you've left yourself enough travel so that you don't run out of any adjustment halfway through cutting the joint. I like to align the edge of the workpiece either directly over the kerf or just beside it, and which approach you take depends on whether you're using the template to position the cuts or the DRO, which is something I'll demonstrate later on how to use the DRO alone. And lastly, we can set up our stop block. Now exactly where you set this will depend on where the blade is making its first cut or whether the blade is actually going to be cutting the first position at all. It all comes down to whether you're starting with a finger or a slot, but once you've worked that out, simply slide the stop block into position and lock it down. So it's finally time to make some cuts. Now I'll show you the first piece from the front of the jig, and then for the second piece we'll move around to the back. That way you can get a better view of how the jig, template and workpiece all interact during the cutting process. I'm also taking it nice and slow for these first cuts, as this is the first piece that this particular sled has done. And I'm just being really cautious here to make sure that everything's working as it's supposed to. So that looks like it's come out really nice, and now it's time to cut its mating piece. And from the opposite angle, we can see how the stop block system works. As we progress across the template, we lift up the tab, move across till we get to the next position, and then pull the tab back down. So for a fit, we're going for the Goldilocks of joints, not too tight and not too loose. We want enough wiggle room to allow the glue to swell the joint, but not so tight that we have to force the joints together. Not too shabby if I don't say myself. So the second method is going to utilize the DRO exclusively. For this method, it's important that you know the kerf of your blade, which in my case is 4mm. Setup for the cut is the same. We place our workpiece in the jig and set it to the edge of the kerf. We can then make sure that our DRO is zeroed out, and we can start making our first cuts. I'm again going for 10mm fingers, so I'll keep cutting and moving the workpiece across till I get to the 10mm mark. And then to make the next finger, I'll skip ahead to the 24mm mark. Remember, our blade is 4mm, so we are adding that in. And again, we'll cut up to the 30mm mark. And then again from the 40mm mark. So basically for each finger, we are adding on the kerf of the blade as our starting point. And we keep repeating this until we are at the end of our cut. And the result is the same, a nicely fitting box joint. So those two quick demonstrations pretty much cover the basics of how this jig works. But in reality, we're only just scratching the surface of what's possible with a jig like this. The patterns that I've used are pretty basic, pretty traditional, but there's absolutely no reason why you should stop here. Different finger widths, uneven spacing, decorative layouts, and even some repeatable patterns are all possible. Ultimately, we're only limited by our imagination and obviously the templates that we can come up with this. And speaking of templates, now is probably a good time to take a closer look at them and explain why they're designed the way they are. So while each of these look like a single template, they're actually two templates in one representing both sides of a joint. Because as we know, a box joint is made up of alternating fingers and slots, with each mating piece needing to be the exact inverse of the other. And the template I've designed allows me to cut one side of the joint and then simply rotate to reveal the inverse pattern for the mating piece. And once again, while I've chosen to 3D print my templates, there's absolutely no requirement for you to do so. So scrap timber, offcuts are actually perfect materials for making templates, especially when they're from the same thickness or the same material as you're building your project from. So there you have it, my take on a box joint jig with ideas inspired by Mario, aka the Woodfather, and Mattias Wandel, and with a few extra ideas of my own thrown into the mix. Now, if you're interested in building your own box joint jig, there are a few suggestions I have for you. If the template system is something that appeals to you, but you potentially prefer to remove some of the mechanical complexity that I've added to mine, then I highly recommend you go check out the Woodfather's box joint jig. Mario has plans available for his jig, and I'll leave links to both his video and to his plans in the description below. On the other hand, if the screw-driven advancement mechanism caught your eye and that's something you're interested in pursuing, then also consider checking out Mattias Wandel's box joint jig. He also has plans available to his version of a box joint jig, and I strongly encourage you to go check that one out as well. And of course, if you're interested in building my version of the box joint jig, then of course I'm going to leave links to plans that'll be available on my website. And of course, this project wouldn't exist if it wasn't for makers like Mario and Mattias. So a big thank you to both of those for sharing their designs and their ideas with the rest of the woodworking world. And finally, a huge thank you to all my channel members, to everyone that has been watching, who has liked, who has subscribed. It's you guys that make it possible to keep making videos. I'm sure this is not the end of this project or you seeing this particular jig. I'd love to do a deep dive into some more box joints, maybe trying to get into some more advanced sort of features or functionality or designs and see where it basically takes us. So until then, thanks for watching and I will see you on the next one.